in his recent opinion piece for the Africa report titled Ethiopia, Pretoria, Stop the War. Politics is imperiling the peace, linked to shortworld.at. Getachew Reda addresses the controversy surrounding his interview with Mehdi Hasan and the fragile state of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, COHA. Below is the full text of the article. Viewpoint: Getachew Reda, Executive Committee member and spokesperson for the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. Getachew Reda opinion: Ethiopia, Pretoria, stop the war. Politics is imperiling the peace. The former head of Tigray's interim authority pushes back on critics of the peace process in Ethiopia. My recent appearance on Al Jazeera's head-to-head with Mehdi Hasan triggered a storm in Ethiopia, and among the many non-Ethiopians who have made a habit of lecturing Ethiopians about Ethiopia, some of the reaction was predictable. The war in Tigray left so much grief, anger, and unfinished business that any public discussion is bound to reopen wounds. Some of it was also revealing. The loudest arguments were less about what I said than about what different factions want the Pretoria Agreement to mean. In the days after the interview, supporters and critics offered competing interpretations of my tone. A few of my opponents seemed to treat any departure from wartime rhetoric as a betrayal of a cause they have assigned me. I do not accept that framing. If my language sounded softer than the language of war, it is because I am interested in peace, not as a slogan, but as a duty to my people. That reaction matters because it speaks to a deeper problem. Political discourse in Tigray, and in Ethiopia more broadly, has become selectively literal. People quote the agreement when it suits them and ignore it when it does not. Pretoria is invoked as a weapon in internal disputes rather than treated as a framework to stabilize a shattered region. 3 years after it ended the most devastating conflict in Ethiopia's recent history, a durable peace remains fragile. The Pretoria Agreement, negotiated between the 23rd of October and the 2nd of November 2022, is one of the most consequential diplomatic achievements in modern Ethiopian politics. It halted a war that killed vast numbers of people and displaced millions. It opened humanitarian corridors and enabled the gradual restoration of services. Yet Pretoria has become less a roadmap out of crisis than a mirror reflecting unresolved fractures. Above all, the struggle over who controls Tigray's post-war political order, a mandate to stop the war, not to bargain. To understand why Pretoria is still contested, it helps to remember the circumstances in which it was signed. When the Tigrayan delegation arrived in Pretoria, it did not come to barter. It came with a stark instruction from the Central Command, the wartime decision-making body in Tigray, agree to a cessation of hostilities virtually without preconditions. That directive was born of a grim private reality many in Tigray recognized but could not say aloud. Prolonging the war risked political annihilation, more civilian deaths, and a threat to Tigray's autonomy. After battlefield reversals and an accelerating humanitarian catastrophe, the leadership prioritized stopping the bleeding over positional bargaining. For that reason, the Tigrayan political and military leadership decided not to table obvious deal breakers at Pretoria. Ending active hostilities and constructing a political order are different tasks. The most sensitive questions, Western Tigray, Raya, and the sequencing of federal troop withdrawals, were not ignored, but they were deliberately kept out of the opening gambit. The logic was simple. If talks collapsed, the consequences would be existential. No one expressed that urgency more forcefully than Debretsion Gebremichael, the TPLF chairman, who repeatedly urged the delegation to sign without delay. Whatever one thinks of the wider conduct of the war, by late 2022, the balance of forces and the humanitarian reality had narrowed the range of viable options. Debretsion's instruction to me as head of delegation was blunt: do not return without a deal. At points, that urgency became frantic. Debretsion would call Mike Hammer, the U.S. Special Envoy, to underline that the delegation could not be sent home empty-handed. On the 1st of November 2022, I texted Debretsion, "Heidi, we are trying everything to get something done. I know you are under pressure, but we are under pressure too. Mike telling me every morning he is being told to fly us home is becoming another stressful experience. We will fly back home because that's where we belong. My hope is we will achieve something and salvage a semblance of authority." On the 2nd of November, the day the agreement was due to be signed, Debretsion sent another message stressing how precarious the situation was on the ground. Salam Adigrat is on the verge, sick of falling to the enemies. If the COH agreement reached can be signed today, that will be fine. If not, we'll make our strategic decision on how we continue our resistance tonight and start execution. Whatever gloss is applied after the fact, Pretoria was not treated inside the leadership as a public relations exercise. It was an attempt to stop a war that Tigray could no longer sustain. A near breakdown and what almost sank the deal. Much of the later commentary in Tigray, often driven by elites competing for legitimacy, claimed the delegation sought to give away Western Tigray or abandon constitutional territorial claims. That is not what happened. In the final hours, it was the federal side, negotiating from a stronger position, that nearly risked collapse. In an 11th-hour move, the federal delegation attempted to insert language that would have stripped the future interim regional administration of authority over Western Tigray and Raya. For the Tigrayan side, the clause was a political non-starter. It would have forced Tigray either to concede its claims or to walk away. Had that language remained, there is a good chance the talks would have failed. The agreement was salvaged through intervention by facilitators, including former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, and, crucially, by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. That Abiy helped rescue the deal may be inconvenient to some narratives, but it is a fact. What Pretoria actually said, and what it did not. Pretoria was never designed as a grand political settlement. It was a ceasefire agreement. Its core provisions were conventional, but necessary. It reaffirmed that the Ethiopian National Defense Force would remain the country's sole army. It set out a process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration for Tigray's forces, a standard post-war mechanism intended to reduce the risk of relapse into conflict. It committed the parties to restore constitutional order in Tigray and to reverse extraordinary administrative measures imposed after the region's 2020 election. The fiercest battles were not over whether Pretoria should exist, but over who would run Tigray under its umbrella. The agreement also set out a transitional justice framework, signaling a commitment to investigate and address wartime abuses. It reaffirmed that contested territorial claims, including Western Tigray and Raya, should be handled through constitutional mechanisms rather than military force. Those pillars were enough to stop a war. They were never sufficient by themselves to build a stable peace. Ending active hostilities and constructing a political order are different tasks. Pretoria achieved the first. Ethiopia and Tigray has struggled with the second. Why implementation stalled? The biggest post-Pretoria problem was not ideological opposition to peace. It was a bitter internal struggle over who would govern Tigray during the transition and who would control the institutions Pretoria made possible. One camp argued for pragmatic implementation through close coordination with the federal government, not because Addis Ababa is altruistic, but because any interim administration would, by definition, have to work with the sitting prime minister and the federal state. Another camp treated the interim structure as a zero-sum arena for political survival and succession. As that struggle intensified, Pretoria was reframed as a test of loyalty rather than a negotiated outcome dictated by battlefield reality. Debretion's own public posture shifted. Within months, the same leader who had pushed relentlessly for an agreement began to suggest the delegation had conceded too much and mishandled the talks. Pretoria became a scapegoat for internal grievances. Pretoria remains the only framework that binds Tigray to Ethiopia's federation and offers a constitutional pathway out of paralysis. The real fault line was power. The fiercest battles were not over whether Pretoria should exist, but over who would run Tigray under its umbrella. That contest undermined unity, slowed implementation, and eroded public trust. It also created space for spoilers and encouraged selective foot-dragging, where cooperation from the federal side was required. The accountability dilemma and Eritrea's shadow, Pretoria's transitional justice clause confronts a hard truth. The war involved multiple armed actors, including foreign forces. Abuses allegedly committed by domestic forces can, at least in principle, be addressed through Ethiopian mechanisms if political will exists. However, Pretoria is largely silent on external actors, above all, Eritrea. Many Tigrayans, and a wide range of independent reports during the war, have alleged grave abuses by Eritrean forces, including killings and widespread sexual violence. Eritrea was not a party to the negotiations and did not sign the agreement. It has also shown no appetite for external scrutiny. No domestic Ethiopian process can credibly adjudicate crimes committed by a foreign military. That creates an accountability asymmetry that continues to poison the peace. Eritrea's exclusion from Pretoria was not an oversight. It was a diplomatic necessity. Bringing Asmara into the room would have risked collapsing the talks. Leaving it out allowed the ceasefire to be signed. But the cost was obvious. A central actor in the war was left outside the peace architecture. Eritrean leaders have publicly criticized the agreement, framing it as an external plot and signaling resentment that it halted what they saw as a decisive final push. Peace as a choice, not a cudgel. Pretoria remains the only framework that binds Tigray to Ethiopia's federation and offers a constitutional pathway out of paralysis. Without Pretoria, or a successor anchored in similar principles, the alternatives are bleak: renewed conflict or prolonged stagnation. Tigray can afford neither. Yet the agreement's future will not be determined by the text alone. It will be determined by choices in Addis Ababa, in Mekelle, and among the wider political class about whether peace is treated as an obligation or used as a cudgel in internal battles. Pretoria proved that diplomacy can stop a war, even in its darkest hour. It also exposed how easily peace can be undermined when political actors weaponize agreements for succession and factional advantage. The war ended in Pretoria, Whether peace takes root depends on whether Ethiopia's leaders and Tigray's decide to implement what they signed rather than endlessly litigate it for power.